My entitled mother insisted I quit my job to take care of her because a daughter's duty is to serve her parents. When I refused, she tried to sue me for neglect. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read my evidence aloud and said, "Then you'll love hearing how much she's stolen from you instead." I never thought I'd end up in court because of my own mother. But there I was, sitting across from her as she fake cried to the judge, telling him how I had abandoned her in her time of need. She painted herself as a helpless old woman, a victim of an ungrateful daughter who had turned her back on family. I sat there silent, waiting. Because I knew something she didn't. I had proof. A lot of proof. And when the judge read it aloud, the courtroom fell dead silent. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to where this all started. My mom has always been selfish. She likes to call herself a single mother who sacrificed everything for me. The truth? She barely worked, constantly blamed others for her problems, and spent every dime she got on herself. When I was 16, I got a part-time job at a local diner. I wanted to save for college, maybe buy some things for myself. But my mother had other plans. "If you live under my roof, your money is my money," she said. She took every paycheck I made. She called it helping with the household. But we all knew the truth. She just wanted extra cash to spend on her gambling and shopping. If I ever asked for any of it back? Screaming. Crying. Guilt trips. "Do you know what I gave up for you? I put a roof over your head, and this is how you repay me?" I learned quickly that nothing was ever mine. By 18, I was done. I got a scholarship, packed my things, and moved across the country for college. That should have been the end of it. But my mother? She hated that I got away. At first, she'd call just to check in. But it was always the same. "You abandoned me. You're so selfish." A daughter's duty is to serve her parents. She'd ask for money. I sent someone I could, even though I knew it would never be enough. If I said no, meltdowns. And then came the threats. "You think you're better than me? Fine. If you don't care about your own mother, maybe someone else will." I ignored her. I thought that if I kept my distance, she'd move on. I was wrong. Last year, I was finally settled in my career. I had worked my way up in finance, had my own apartment, and was doing well. Life was peaceful. Then my mother called. Not to ask. To demand. "Quit your job and move back home. I need you to take care of me." She didn't ask if I could do it. She didn't even explain why. Just a demand, like I owed her my entire life. I left. "Mom, I work full-time. I can't just drop everything." She went ballistic. "I raised you. You owe me. I sacrificed everything for you. You wouldn't even have this job if it weren't for me." She screamed. She cried. She ranted about how filial piety meant I had no choice. I told her no. And that's when she snapped. First, she tried to ruin my life. She called my job and told them I was a thief and a drug addict. Luckily, my boss knew me well enough to not believe her, but it was still humiliating. She called my landlord and told them I was running an illegal business from my apartment. That didn't work either, but now my landlord thought I had a crazy stalker. She even went on Facebook and posted long rants about how I had abandoned her, claiming she was homeless and starving because of me. None of it worked. I blocked her. Then, a week later, I got a letter in the mail. She was suing me for parental neglect. I walked into the courtroom, and there she was, fake tears and all, clutching a tissue like she was some tragic victim. She told the judge how I had abandoned her. How she had no money, no food, no support. She even brought witnesses. Her friends, who had only ever heard her side of the story, came up and talked about what a loving mother she was. She made it sound like I was some rich, selfish brat who had thrown her own mother onto the streets. The judge turned to me. "Do you have any evidence?" Oh, I had plenty. I calmly handed over a thick binder of documents. Heavy checkmark bank statements showing I had sent her thousands of dollars over the years. Heavy checkmark text messages where she demanded money and threatened me when I refused. Heavy checkmark a recording of her screaming that she would ruin my life if I didn't obey her. Heavy checkmark credit reports showing that she had stolen my identity and taken out over $25,000 in loans under my name. The judge flipped through the pages. The courtroom got very quiet. Then he looked at her and said, "Then you'll love hearing how much she has stolen from you instead." Her face turned white. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't over yet. Her face turned white. I watched her grip the edge of the table, her hands shaking. This was the moment she realized her little scheme had backfired. She had spent her whole life getting away with lies, manipulating people, playing the victim. But not this time. The judge looked at her over the top of my evidence file. His expression was unreadable. Then he turned to me. "Would you like to press charges?" The courtroom fell silent. Before I could even answer, my mother shot up from her chair. "This is a lie," she screeched, pointing at me. "She made it all up. I'm her mother. She can't do this to me." The judge barely looked up. "Ma'am, sit down." But she wasn't done. She turned to her own lawyer, yanking on his sleeve. "Do something." The guy looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. He just rubbed his temples and whispered something to her. Probably something along the lines of, "You're screwed." I kept my face blank. I wasn't about to let her see me smile. The judge sighed. "We will take a short recess. When we return, I will address this new information." My mother stormed out of the courtroom, shoving past people, her face bright red. Her friends, the ones she brought in as witnesses, looked shocked. One of them even whispered, "She never told us about that." Yeah, no kidding. During the break, my mother tried to get me alone. I could hear her shouting my name in the hallway. I ignored her and stayed in the conference room with my lawyer. Her lawyer, meanwhile, came in looking exhausted. "Would you be open to a settlement?" he asked me. I almost laughed. A settlement? After all of this? "No," he sighed, rubbing his face. That's what I thought. He left, and we went back into the courtroom. My mother was already in her seat, but now she looked different. Instead of crying, she looked furious. The second the judge came back, she cut him off. "Your Honor, I'd like to drop the case." The courtroom murmured. The judge raised an eyebrow. "You filed this lawsuit and now you want to drop it?" "Yes." She forced a smile. "This was all a misunderstanding." "Liar." The judge tapped his pen on the desk. "That's not how this works, ma'am. And given the evidence against you, I have a few questions before we decide anything." Her smile twitched. She knew she had lost. And then, just when I thought she couldn't go any lower, "Your Honor," she said sweetly, "I was tricked. My daughter has always been difficult. I was manipulated into believing she had abandoned me. I see now that I was misled. I only filed this case out of desperation because she refused to communicate with me." Unbelievable. I felt my hands clench into fists under the table. But the judge wasn't buying it. "Ms. Mother's last name, are you claiming your daughter forced you to steal her identity?" She flinched. "WL, no, but are you saying the texts where you threatened her are fake?" She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I was just upset. Mothers say things they don't mean. The judge stared at her. The whole courtroom did. Then he spoke the words that sent a chill down my spine. "We will be referring this case to the state prosecutor's office for further investigation." That was it. That was the moment my mother realized she wasn't getting away with this. She lost it. "She's my daughter," she screamed, slamming her hands on the table. "I have a right to her money." The entire courtroom gasped. Even her own lawyer looked horrified. The judge leaned back in his chair and stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded to the bailiff. "Remove her from the courtroom." The bailiff stepped forward, but my mother wasn't done. She lunged at me. She didn't get far. The bailiff caught her and dragged her out, kicking and screaming the whole way. I sat there frozen. Not because I was scared. Because I had never seen her this unhinged before. And for the first time, I realized something. She wasn't just angry. She was desperate. The hearing ended with no decision yet. The judge needed time to review everything. But as I walked out, something gnawed at me. Why had she escalated this much? Why now? My lawyer turned to me. "I think there's more to this." And he was right. 2 days later, I found out. My mother wasn't just in trouble with me. She was in trouble with the government. And that's when things got really insane. I should have been relieved when the judge had her dragged out of the courtroom. I should have felt free. Instead, I felt uneasy. Because something wasn't right. My mother had always been manipulative, controlling, and selfish. But this was different. This was desperation. And I was about to find out why. 2 days after the hearing, I got a call from an unknown number. I usually don't pick those up, but something told me to. "Is this my name?" The voice was serious. Professional. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Agent Miller with the Office of the Inspector General." My stomach dropped. "What the hell?" Okay," I said. "I need to ask you some questions about your mother, her full name. Are you available to come in for a meeting?" Oh, this was bad. I showed up at the federal building downtown the next morning. Agent Miller was waiting for me in a small, sterile room. He was middle-aged, serious-looking, and got straight to the point. "Your mother is currently under investigation for fraud." I sat up straighter. "What kind of fraud?" He opened a file and slid some papers toward me. My mother's name was on them. And next to it, words that made my blood run cold. Social Security fraud. Medicare fraud. Identity theft. What is this?" I asked, even though I already knew. Agent Miller laced his fingers together. "We've been tracking your mother for over a year. She's been collecting disability benefits while working under the table. She's also been using multiple identities to open fraudulent credit accounts. I blinked. Wait, multiple identities? He flipped to another page. And that's when I saw it. Not just my name. My dead grandmother's name. My dead aunt's name. My cousin's name. She had been stealing from everyone. Turns out, my mother had been scamming the government for years. She'd been collecting disability even though she wasn't disabled. She had faked medical conditions, lied about her income, and even faked a back injury to get extra payouts. And now? The government was coming for her. Agent Miller tapped his pen on the table. We were actually preparing to bring charges when we saw your case pop up in civil court. That's why I called you. I stared at him. So, what happens now? We're moving forward with criminal charges. Given the amount of fraud involved, your mother is looking at serious time. I exhaled slowly. Does she know yet? He shook his head. Not yet. But she will soon. That night, I got another call. This time, it was from her. I almost didn't answer. But something told me to pick up. The second I did, she was sobbing. Sweetheart, please. I need you. I didn't say anything. I made a mistake. I got in over my head. But you're my daughter. You're supposed to help me. I knew what she was doing. She had no idea the feds were already onto her. She thought if she could get me back on her side, maybe I'd drop everything. Maybe I'd even take the fall for her. I let her cry for a while. Then I said, Mom, did you steal Grandma's identity? Silence. Then, that's none of your business. Click. She hung up. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't over yet. She wasn't going to go down quietly. She was going to fight. And she was going to drag me with her if she could. She hung up on me. I stared at my phone, my heart pounding. She knew. She knew the walls were closing in, and instead of owning up to anything, she was going to do what she always did, lie, manipulate, and drag me down with her. But this time, she was out of moves. 2 days later, I got the call. Agent Miller. Your mother has been taken into custody. It was happening. It was actually happening. She had been arrested for fraud, identity theft, and theft of government funds. She was being held without bail. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt empty. This woman had made my life hell for years. She had stolen from me, humiliated me, tried to ruin my career, and even sued me when I didn't bow to her demands. And yet, when I imagined her sitting in a cold, gray cell, all I felt was exhaustion. Because I knew this wasn't over yet. A month later, I had to see her again. I was called to testify against her. When I walked into the courtroom, she was already there, handcuffed and wearing a county jumpsuit. She looked smaller somehow, thinner. But when her eyes met mine, the fire was still there. You did this to me, she mouthed. No, she did this to herself. The prosecutor laid everything out. Heavy checkmark years of fraudulent disability claims. Heavy checkmark thousands of dollars stolen from multiple family members. Heavy checkmark fake medical conditions she used to get extra benefits. Heavy checkmark credit cards opened in MY name. My cousin's name, and even her dead mother's name. I had been prepared for her to cry. To beg. I wasn't prepared for her rage. She shot up from her chair so fast that the bailiff had to grab her. I was a single mother, she shrieked. I did what I had to do to survive. The entire courtroom stared. The judge banged his gavel. Ma'am, sit down. But she wasn't finished. You think you're better than me? She screamed at me. After everything I did for you? And that was the moment. That was when I finally felt something other than exhaustion. I felt done. I stood up slowly. My voice was calm, steady. You didn't do this for me. You did this for yourself. Her face twisted with rage. I raised you, she spat. You owe me. I met her eyes. I owe you nothing. She lunged. The bailiffs were on her in seconds, restraining her as she screamed and thrashed. The courtroom was dead silent. And just like that, the last piece of our twisted, toxic relationship shattered. She wasn't my mother anymore. She was just a woman who had destroyed her own life. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison for fraud, theft, and identity crimes. I didn't go to the sentencing. I didn't write a statement. I was done. Her friends, the ones who had defended her, started reaching out. Some apologized. Some tried to justify her actions. I ignored them all. One day, my cousin called me. Did you hear? She's been writing letters to people, telling them you framed her. Of course she was. I just left. For the first time in my life, I didn't care what she said about me. She had no power over me anymore. 3 months into her sentence, I got a letter from her. I didn't open it. I threw it in the trash. Maybe she was apologizing. Maybe she was blaming me again. It didn't matter. I was free. And this time? She couldn't take that away from me. I still have nightmares sometimes. I still hear her voice in my head, telling me I'm selfish, that I'm a bad daughter. But I wake up in my own apartment, in my own life, and I remind myself, she's gone. She can't hurt me anymore. And that is the best revenge I could ever ask for.